Imagine a man who was torn from his freedom, forced to fight in arenas and treated as an object. A slave who, against all odds, refused to bow down and dared to challenge the most powerful empire in the world. That man was Spartacus. But do we know the true story behind this forbidden hero? Much more than just a simple gladiator, Spartacus led a revolt that shook the foundations of Rome, challenging not only soldiers and senators, but the very idea of an invincible empire. He was the spark of a revolution, a fight for freedom that exposed the cruelty of the Roman system and showcased the strength of the oppressed. In this analysis, you will discover the secrets, betrayals, and hidden strategies that nearly brought down the greatest empire of antiquity. We will unveil the hidden truth about Spartacus, the hero who dared to dream of freedom for all. Get ready, because this story will surprise and inspire you. Imagine a dark time where men and women captured in battles or bought as goods were forced to serve, to fight, and even to die for an empire that showed no mercy. It was ancient Rome, a place where the glory of a few was built on the suffering of many. Among these captives stood a man of indomitable spirit, Spartacus. Born in Thrace, a land where strength and courage were virtues, he was not the typical slave. In his eyes burned a fire that even the cruelest Roman could not extinguish. Spartacus did not accept the fate that was imposed on him. For him, freedom was not an empty word, but something as vital as the air he breathed. His days as a gladiator, where he fought to entertain the Roman people, only served to intensify his thirst for freedom. During long nights between exhausting training sessions and the brutality of the guards, he began to plan, to dream of the impossible, breaking the chains, freeing his companions, and challenging the most powerful empire in the world. Have you ever tried to understand the wars that made Rome the greatest empire in the world, but ended up getting lost in so many confusing details? If so, you are not alone. Imagine finally mastering the most important details that shaped Rome, knowing the strategies of great generals like Julius Caesar and Scipio Africanus, and understanding how these maneuvers changed the course of history. Knowing the difficulty of finding this information, I made available my digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire, where you will have access to all of this clearly and directly. Understand how Rome won impossible battles, learn curiosities you won't find elsewhere, and become an expert in Roman military history. Access the pinned comment and acquire yours now, as our units are running out. Let's continue talking about Spartacus. The opportunity came on a dark night when the sky was covered with heavy clouds and silence took over the cells. Spartacus, with the keen vision of a born leader, gathered the most fearless companions. They knew there was no turning back. With knives stolen from the kitchen, improvised weapons, and fierce determination, they attacked and managed to escape. It was the first step of a rebellion that Rome would never forget. But they did not flee to hide. Each victory was born from a carefully thought-out strategy by Spartacus, who knew the Roman army and how to use it against itself. He understood the psychology of the soldiers, the tactics, and the weaknesses of the army he had once served. He and his followers, who now numbered in the thousands, faced Rome in battles that surprised even the most experienced generals. Rumors about this growing force began to spread like wildfire. From mouth to mouth, from village to village, the stories of Spartacus traveled faster than the winds sweeping across the fields. Slaves from all over, upon hearing about the man who challenged Rome, joined the cause. In no time, Spartacus was not merely leading a group of fugitives. He was leading a true army, made up of over 70,000 men and women determined to fight for their lives and their freedom. The first battle was a surprise. The Roman soldiers, confident in their strength and discipline, expected an easy victory. But Spartacus and his men, with ingenious tactics, defeated the imperial troops. The sensation of victory, of seeing the Roman soldiers retreating, was something those former slaves would never forget. For many, it was the first time they tasted true freedom. Each victory brought new challenges. But Spartacus was more than just a warrior. He was a strategist. He knew that to face Rome, he would need more than brute strength. He organized his army, taught them to fight in formation, to use the terrain to their advantage, and, above all, to trust one another. He understood that the Romans did not see slaves as people, but he transformed those men and women into warriors fighting for something much greater than themselves. Rome could no longer ignore this threat. The Roman elites, accustomed to comfort and power, began to worry. How could a group of slaves led by a gladiator challenge the military might of an empire? With each victory, Spartacus not only destroyed troops, but also shook the power structures of Rome. With every battle, he became a symbol of resistance, someone who inspired fear among the powerful and hope among the oppressed. Spartacus's rebellion was not just a fight for freedom, it was a cry against centuries of injustice. And with that cry, he echoed in the hearts of those who believed in the impossible, who longed for a life free from chains and the brutality of Rome. Before continuing to tell the story of this thrilling revolt, make sure to remember the name and image of this channel, so you can always return to this reliable source about the history of Rome. Now check if you've already subscribed, because here you will find rigorously researched and presented facts about one of the most influential civilizations in history. Spartacus was a man of striking presence, with eyes that seemed to see far beyond what was visible, and a mind that worked quickly and strategically. Historians like Plutarch and Appian say he was not an ordinary slave. He possessed rare intelligence, something that both terrified and scorned the Romans, as they knew that a man with his level of insight could easily become dangerous. But Spartacus was not just intelligent, he was also educated, which meant he had an education that went beyond martial skills. In his youth, before becoming a slave, Spartacus was a soldier in the service of Rome, marching alongside the legionnaires in various battles. This experience shaped his character and taught him the secrets of combat. He knew, for example, how the Romans thought, how they planned their attacks, and how they defended their fortresses. He understood the discipline required on the battlefield and how each soldier was trained to follow orders with precision. These lessons would remain etched in his mind, ready to be used in the future in ways that Rome could never imagine. The transformation from soldier to slave was a brutal blow. At some point, Spartacus fell into disgrace. Perhaps he was unjustly accused of treason or deserted for an unknown reason. The records are unclear about how it happened, but his fate changed forever. He was captured, shackled, and sold as a mere object. A man who once wielded a sword with honor was now just another piece in the slave market. For him, this was an insult to his very existence. But Spartacus did not allow despair to dominate him. He kept a cool mind and continued to observe, even in his new condition. His life was now in the arenas, under the command of a lanista, a gladiator owner who trained men to fight to the death. The life of a gladiator was inhumane. They trained until exhaustion and fought to entertain the crowds that packed the arenas. Each fight was a dance with death, where only the strongest survived. Spartacus knew that this was not the end he wanted for himself. He began to observe how the gladiator school operated, noting how the guards moved, where the weapons were, and even where the walls were lower. For Spartacus, the fight was not just a matter of survival. He viewed every sword and shield movement as an opportunity to learn, every training session as a chance to improve his skills. His fellow gladiators began to notice his natural leadership. Spartacus was not only a skilled fighter, but a man who inspired confidence and respect. He spoke about freedom, about the chance to one day escape their cruel fate, to break the chains that held them captive. His charismatic demeanor and courage caused many of the gladiators to begin following him, forming an invisible bond between them that strengthened with each training and fight. Spartacus planted a simple yet powerful idea in their hearts. They could be free. And so slowly, he prepared a plan that seemed impossible, an escape plan that would turn into one of the greatest rebellions Rome had ever witnessed. Tell me in the comments if you know Spartacus, and if you have any curiosities you would like to share. It was a thick and silent night, with darkness seemingly enveloping every corner of the gladiator school. Spartacus and his companions waited, their hearts pounding as they prepared for what would be the decisive moment of their lives. They had no shining armor or sharp swords like those of the Roman soldiers. Their weapons were improvised, kitchen knives, iron spikes, and sharp pieces of wood, anything they could quickly and discreetly gather. For them, each object represented a chance, a small spark of hope that could open the doors to freedom. The plan was simple but risky. They knew they could not waver. They needed to act in perfect synchrony and complete silence. Spartacus, with his focused and attentive gaze, gave the signal. And in the blink of an eye, they launched themselves at the guards on duty, surprising them with quick and precise attacks. The guards had no chance. Within minutes, Spartacus and his allies found themselves outside the walls of the gladiator school, inhaling the fresh night air as free men. The taste of freedom was new, intense, and the stars above seemed to witness that unforgettable moment. But Spartacus knew that the real fight was still to come. He was aware that Rome would not allow a group of fugitive gladiators to wander peacefully. They needed to strengthen themselves, grow in number, and arm themselves adequately to face the Roman army, which would inevitably come after them. In the days that followed, Spartacus and his group of gladiators traveled through nearby villages and towns. And wherever they went, they attracted other slaves, oppressed peasants, and even deserter soldiers who desired a new beginning. The news of the bold escape and Spartacus's courage spread like wildfire, inspiring all those who longed for freedom to join him. With each new face that arrived, Spartacus shared his vision. He gathered everyone around a campfire, where, with a firm voice, he spoke about the future he dreamed for them. A future without chains, without tyranny, where each person could own their own life. Spartacus became an almost mythical figure, someone who represented more than just a leader. He was embodied hope, the symbol of a struggle for dignity and justice. The group grew rapidly, and Spartacus knew that mere courage would not be enough. He needed to prepare his army. He spent long hours teaching the new recruits how to wield weapons, how to fight in formation, and how to defend themselves as a true army. Those men and women, many of whom had never held a sword before, now trained tirelessly under his command. The field where they hid echoed with sounds of training, shouts of encouragement, and sometimes laughter as hope and camaraderie grew among them. And don't forget to get your digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. It's very important that you grab it now before the units run out. When Rome finally sent troops to deal with the fugitives, the commanders were confident that it would be a simple mission. After all, they were professional soldiers facing a group of slaves armed in a rudimentary way. But Spartacus, with his strategic mind and knowledge of Roman tactics, had transformed that heterogeneous group into something unexpected. He took advantage of the terrain, positioned his army in ambushes, and used tactics he learned while serving Rome. When the Roman soldiers arrived, they did not find a disorganized group of fugitives. Instead, they were surprised by a determined and disciplined army, led by a leader who knew their weaknesses. The first battle was intense, but it ended with an impressive victory for Spartacus and his followers. The Romans were forced to retreat, and for those former slaves, the taste of victory was almost unbelievable. For the first time, they were not just survivors. They were winners, men and women who had defeated the powerful Roman army. This initial victory had a profound impact. More people began to arrive, bringing their stories, their pain, and their hopes. Spartacus's rebellion was no longer just an escape. It had become a living force that challenged the very heart of the empire. With each new face that joined him, Spartacus found another reason to continue. He trained them, encouraged them, and listened to their stories of suffering. What started as a desperate escape was now a force that grew stronger every day. To Rome, they were a threat. To the oppressed, they were a symbol of freedom. Thus, Spartacus and his followers, armed with hope and driven by unwavering determination, marched from victory to victory, facing Rome head-on, unafraid, and building a dream that seemed impossible. If you are enjoying this content and believe these stories of Rome are helping you better understand the empire that shaped the world, don't forget to leave a like. This not only helps spread the true story of Rome to more people, but also ensures that YouTube shows you more videos like this. So give a like and strengthen this journey of historical discoveries. Spartacus was no longer just a fleeing gladiator. He was a living legend, a symbol of freedom that Rome was beginning to fear. With every city, village, and field he crossed in Campania, more allies joined his cause. Slaves from all backgrounds, men who had worked to exhaustion on the plantations, women who saw their families torn away from them, peasants who could barely sustain their own lives. Each brought with them their own story of suffering, and more than that, an insatiable desire for change. Around the campfires, while the group rested, Spartacus walked among them, listening to every voice, every lament, and turned it all into a silent vow. He would fight to the end, not just for himself, but for all who followed him. He saw the eyes of the slaves, hungry for justice and for a tomorrow where the word freedom was more than a distant dream. Spartacus shared words of courage, recalled the victories they had already achieved, and spoke of those yet to come. For them, he was not just a leader, he was a brother, someone who understood what it was like to live without choices. The victories of Spartacus did not happen by chance. He was astute, calculating, and knew the weaknesses of the Romans like few others. He used the knowledge he acquired as a Roman soldier to think like them, anticipate their movements, and turn every disadvantage into a chance for victory. In one of these battles, the Roman troops managed to surround Spartacus's camp. The terrain was a steep mountain, with no visible escape for the army of gladiators and peasants. It was a perfect trap, a final blow that the Romans thought they had delivered. Any ordinary commander would have surrendered, but Spartacus was not just any commander. Observing the landscape around him, he had a bold and almost unthinkable idea. He looked at the slopes of the mountain, covered with vines and trees with strong roots. He called some of his men and ordered them to braid ropes from the vines, something that would take time and patience. To the gladiators, the idea seemed absurd, but Spartacus, with his calm and natural authority, convinced them. Those vines which grew on the rocks would be their escape. And under the cover of night, when the Romans were asleep and confident in their victory, the group began to descend quietly down the mountainside, using the improvised ropes. Every step was a challenge, with the wind cutting across their faces and the uneven ground beneath their feet. But they knew that the success of this maneuver meant the difference between freedom and death. They descended slowly, carefully, as Spartacus guided them like a true leader. The confidence he inspired in them was so great that no one doubted they would succeed. When they finally reached solid ground, they were tired but free and invisible to the eyes of the Romans. The next morning, the Roman soldiers woke up to find the camp empty. In complete silence, Spartacus and his army had vanished, leaving only traces of extinguished campfires and a humiliation that Rome would never expect. The Romans were disoriented and furious, as if they had been tricked by shadows. And once again, Spartacus had defeated them, not with force, but with intelligence and strategy. The fame of Spartacus grew, and the news of this escape spread quickly. For the slaves and peasants who heard the stories, he was not just a man, he was a legend. More and more people, inspired by his courage and cunning, came from all corners of Campania to join his army. They brought sickles, sticks, rusty tools, anything that could serve as a weapon. And more than that, they brought an unshakable determination to fight for a future without chains. Spartacus welcomed them with humility, knowing that each new face represented a new life to fight for. He trained them, guided each one in combat tactics, and taught them to fight together as a unit. They were not Roman soldiers, but under Spartacus's command, they formed a force that Rome could not ignore. His allies were not just armed peasants. They were men and women willing to give everything for freedom. Thus, with each battle won, with each siege overcome, Spartacus made it clear that his army was not just a simple band of fugitives. He was the living resistance, a force for justice that grew stronger every day, ready to challenge the heart of the empire. And while Rome plotted its next moves, Spartacus and his followers knew they were ready to face anything that came their way, for the dream of freedom now burned brightly in each of them. Tell me in the comments if you knew this story about Spartacus, and if there is anything we might have forgotten to mention. I want to know your knowledge. As Spartacus's victories accumulated, he began to see beyond the battlefields of Italy. He knew that Rome was a formidable enemy, but he also understood that if they stayed there, they would eventually be crushed. Thus, a new plan was born in his mind, to take his army beyond the Alps, a formidable mountain range that would separate them from Rome and lead them to true freedom, far from the Roman legions. Spartacus imagined crossing the Alps as a path to a different life. He dreamed of a place where his army, made up of men and women who had been treated for so long as nothing more than merchandise and tools of labor, could live in peace. He wanted more than endless battles. He wanted to give these people a chance to live, to raise their families, and to forever distance themselves from the shadows of Rome. However, there was an opposing force within his own army. Crixus, his loyal ally and a gladiator of unquestionable courage, saw the war through different eyes. For him, the fight against Rome was a chance for revenge, to make Rome bleed for everything it had done to them. Crixus wanted to stay. He wanted to confront the legions head-on to prove that even the most humiliated, those whom Rome discarded as less than human, could rise up and defeat the most powerful empire in the world. He believed that abandoning the fight would be a sign of weakness, an undignified escape from the strength they were building together. Spartacus and Crixus began to deeply disagree. Their conversations, which had once been harmonious and filled with respect, became tense, as if they were both treading on mined ground. Spartacus argued that although the army had achieved brilliant victories, Rome continued to send more troops and surround them. He explained that by crossing the Alps, they would definitively escape the empire's grasp. But Crixus saw this as a renunciation, a cowardly retreat. For him, leaving Italy without one last fight was betraying everything they had sacrificed for. These disagreements inflamed the spirit of many in the army. Men and women, especially those who had suffered the worst cruelties under Roman rule, felt the weight of vengeance pulsing in their veins. They followed Crixus, believing that true freedom would come from confronting the enemy and making Rome pay for every destroyed life. In their eyes, crossing the Alps was abandoning the chance to prove the strength they had earned with so much blood and sweat. Spartacus, on the other hand, continued with his vision of a peaceful freedom, away from conflicts. He saw the mountains as a new life for his people, where they could finally rest from all that brutality. But he also understood Crixus's fury and that of his followers. He knew that for many, the idea of leaving without finishing the battle was unbearable. With a heavy heart, Spartacus realized that there was no way to prevent the division, for every man and woman there had the right to choose their own path. Thus, with a sad look, Spartacus respected Crixus's decision and allowed him and his followers to proceed with their plans to confront the enemy. The army that had once been united by a dream began to divide. Crixus and his men separated, each with their weapons in hand and the determination to give everything for the fight they deemed just. Spartacus watched as they departed, aware that he was losing valuable allies and that this rupture weakened his own vision of freedom. He turned to those who remained and, with a firm look, promised that together they would cross the Alps and find the peace they sought. But as they marched toward the mountainous horizon, Spartacus could not help but feel the weight of the decision. The road ahead was dangerous, and the internal division had sown seeds of uncertainty. Even so, he moved forward, guiding his people north toward the mountains that represented both the challenge and the hope of a distant future. I see here that you forgot to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the content we always bring about Rome. When the name Spartacus became synonymous with resistance and boldness, the Romans realized they were not facing a simple revolt. Spartacus and his army were a threat to the very pride of the empire, something Rome could not ignore. It was necessary to act with maximum force, and so they called upon a man whose reputation for strict discipline and ruthlessness was known throughout the Republic: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in Rome. Ambitious and cunning, he knew that this challenge was the opportunity to prove his skill as a strategist. For him, this mission was not just another campaign, it was a matter of honor in consolidating his reputation. Crassus had no intention of failing and already knew what he had to do. He wanted not only to defeat Spartacus, but to crush any sign of weakness or fear within his own troops. From the very first day, Crassus made it clear that there would be no room for hesitation. And to impose respect and discipline, he resorted to a brutal method: decimation. If any unit showed cowardice or disobedience, 1 in every 10 soldiers would be executed by their own comrades. It was an ancient practice, but Crassus believed that brutality would make his army unshakable. The fear he instilled spread rapidly, and his soldiers soon understood that they were facing an unrelenting leader who demanded nothing less than absolute loyalty. With his troops under strict control, Crassus devised a meticulous plan to capture Spartacus. Knowing that the rebel leader was a cunning strategist who was well acquainted with Roman tactics, Crassus decided not to engage in direct combat. Instead, he opted for a siege strategy, which required patience and precision. Crassus began constructing a massive line of ditches and fortifications around Spartacus's camp, a true ring of containment. This siege extended for miles, turning the area into an open-air prison. The goal was simple yet effective: to cut off any access Spartacus had to supplies, to limit his escape options, and, over time, to weaken him. Crassus wanted to exhaust his enemies, forcing them to surrender out of fatigue and hunger. He knew that each passing day weakened Spartacus and his followers, and that deprivation would inevitably push them to their limits. And always remember that whenever you want to know how this incredible civilization that was Rome became so great, just grab your digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire, which I left in the pinned comment for you to get. The units are running out, so get yours today. The final battle was upon them, and Spartacus knew that this moment would define his legacy forever. Surrounded, without supplies, and with only a few men by his side, he watched the vast Roman army approach. The scene was one of almost palpable tension, the silence of dawn cut only by the sound of Roman armor and the sounding of war trumpets. Spartacus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was not just fighting for his own life, but for every man and woman who had joined him in the quest for freedom. Before the battle began, he gathered his men and looked at them intensely, as if he wanted to engrave into each face the reason they were there. With a firm voice, yet filled with emotion, he told them that this fight was the last act of their rebellion, that each one there would fight not only for themselves, but for those who still lived under Roman chains. They knew that the chance of victory was minimal, but Spartacus inspired them to face their fate bravely, showing Rome that, even at the risk of death, they would never surrender. When the combat began, the field was engulfed in a storm of steel and cries. Spartacus advanced at the forefront, as always, striking blows with a ferocity that seemed impossible for a man so injured and exhausted. Every movement he made was filled with strength and determination, an expression of his warrior soul. He fought with everything he had, with a courage that echoed among his men, inspiring them to fight with equal intensity. Even as the Roman lines advanced, Spartacus and his followers held firm, blow by blow, refusing to yield. But the weight of the battle was immense. The Roman soldiers, more numerous and well-armed, slowly forced the rebels to retreat. Spartacus continued to fight, even when he was severely wounded in the leg. He refused to fall. With his shield raised and his sword firmly in hand, he defended his position, facing each enemy as if they were the last. He knew his fate was sealed, but for him, every moment of struggle was an affirmation of his freedom and his indomitable spirit. Finally, with his body marked by battles, Spartacus fell. The battlefield was filled with a heavy silence. There was the man who dared to challenge Rome, who turned slaves into warriors and raised an army of the oppressed. To the Romans, he was just another defeated rebel, but to his men, he was the symbol of immortal courage. Rome, in its thirst for power, decided to send a message of fear to all who might think of following Spartacus's example. Crassus ordered that 6,000 of the survivors from the rebel army be crucified along the Appian Way, the road that led directly to Rome. And so the revolt of Spartacus came to an end. A man who started as a slave, captured and without hope, managed to challenge Rome with a strength and courage that no one imagined. Spartacus fought not only for himself, but for every person who wished to be free. Even when he knew that the chances of victory were slim, he never gave up the fight for what he believed in. You can find this content about Spartacus and much more in the digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire, which I left in the pinned comment for you to grab. The units are limited, so make sure to get yours today. The story of Spartacus reminds us that sometimes the struggle for freedom and justice can come at a high price, but it also shows that one person's courage can inspire thousands. His spirit of resistance and the sacrifice of his men left a mark that Rome could never erase. This helps us bring more epic content to you. And if you want to know more about other revolts and historical heroes, leave your comment down below. See you in the next video.